challenge to ethics, which is moral relativism. Again, this is something very familiar. It refers to an idea that you've probably encountered before, and maybe if some of you accept some version of this idea. The idea is that right and wrong is relative to culture, that moral goodness, what is morally right, is dependent on what people approve of in the place that you find yourself in. So the implication is that people from different cultures cannot agree on right and wrong, and there will always be deep differences of opinion on right and wrong, just because people belong to different cultures, people from different geographic locations, people from different socioeconomic groups, from different regions, speaking different languages, worshiping different gods, wearing different clothes, having to deal with different realities around them. They make up right and wrong, and it's rooted in their culture, and they cannot go beyond this, right? Now, one philosopher, James Rachels, says we must look more closely at cultural differences before we buy in too quickly to the moral relativism idea, according to which ethics is hopeless because of a mere descriptive fact, which is that there are different cultures. That's just a fact. That's just a reality, right? So this guy says we must look at what is supposedly insurmountable. We must look closely at what's supposedly insurmountable cultural differences. And he presents evidence and multiple examples. Here I'll talk of one where he points to underlying points of agreement despite cultural variation, that underneath vast differences of cultural practice, there is actually underlying commitment to the same values and maybe even an emerging consensus. The example I'll talk about is something from ancient history. So there was this king in Persia who prided himself on being a kind of cosmopolitan, and his name was Darius. King Darius was impressed by the different peoples under him. So he had this huge empire and people with different practices, different languages, worshiping different gods, came under his authority. And one day he called two different groups, the Greeks and the Galatians, and he specifically inquired into their funeral practices, what they do with their dead. And maybe this is something that's relevant for us today in the pandemic when so many people are tragically dying. But almost everywhere where there are human beings, there are funerary practices. There are things that people do with their dead. The Greeks were asked, what do you do with your dead loved ones, friends and family? The Greeks said, we burn them. Greeks are famous for having what's called a funeral pyre. So it's like it's almost like an altar. The dead person is put on something that's supported by firewood all around, and then they set fire to it and it burns the body. And then there's a whole ritual. There's a whole body of ritual that goes with that. So that's what the Greeks did with their dead. And the Galatians were asked by Darius, what do you do with your dead? And the Galatians said, we eat them. We eat them. And this is horrifying and surprising and seems to be like really an instance of an insurmountable cultural difference, because the Galatians are doing something completely unheard of and sounds completely horrible to many people, including the Greeks, including to us. And Darius even tried to bribe his way to changing these people's funeral practices. So he told the Greeks, I can give you as much gold as you want, provided you stop burning your dead. You start eating them instead. And the Greeks said, are you crazy? We're not going to do that. We're not going to accept the gold that you can give just so we can change the funeral practices. Galatians were given this is a similar offer. Are they willing to stop eating their dead, but instead burning them in the way that the Greeks do? And the Galatians were equally horrified and equally scandalized. They were unwilling to accept any amount that would change their practices. And then Darius asked them, both groups, both the Greeks and the Galatians, why they do what they do with their dead loved ones. And the Greeks responded, the funeral practice of burning is an honor to our deceased loved ones. It honors them. It inscribes them, their lives in our memory, and so on. And the Galatians were asked, why do you do that anyway? Why do you eat your dead? And the Galatians said, we do that because we want to honor them. We want them to literally live in us. So Rachel's point in this example is that we have varying, widely diverse practices with regard to the dead, but we have the same underlying value, which is respect for loved ones who have passed on, and a certain social practice that's done by an entire community that's meaningful to them because of how it honors and remembers the deceased loved ones. So here, our only conclusion is we should not jump too quickly from the description, the reality that there are diverse cultures and diverse opinions on moral matters, to the conclusion that there's nothing we can do, there can be no agreement, there can be no consensus, there can be no reasonable argumentation in the way that we described in the previous module. We will return to the point of moral relativism. If you're interested in this question, there is a text called Trying Out One's New Sword. It's one of your required readings. You can read that ahead. It's about the practice of the Japanese samurai of testing exactly a new sword. Right? So you can read about that, and we will discuss that in about 2 weeks or something like that. Okay, so that's how we address relativism at this point. Now, here's another challenge, seeming challenge to ethics, and it comes from the direction of religion. Now, I have heard some comments from students about how ethics seems to be values education, or in this country, because we are predominantly Catholic and Christian education. Now, there is a tendency to equate morality with religion. It's pervasive, and not only in the Christian tradition. We know that of the monotheist religions, and even in places like India, where they have, in the Hindu tradition is not monotheistic, we have a tendency to equate right and wrong with religious practice. Right? Theists are people who believe in God. Theists equate moral goodness with what is pleasing to God. So a problem, so maybe this is some version of the moral relativism problem again. In the same way that there are different cultures, there are different religions, and there are different gods. There is Allah in Islam, Yahweh in the Jewish tradition, and the Godhead in Christianity, which is continuous with Yahweh because the Christians consider the Torah the Old Testament. But in all these different traditions, there is a tendency to equate morality with what is pleasing to God. Now, I have a picture here of Socrates because in one of Plato's early dialogues called the Euthyphro, so I have the name here, that's the name of a person. It's also the name of a dialogue, a text where this very question is discussed. Can we equate goodness with piety? Can we equate morality with religion. You probably know that the Greeks are not monotheistic. Either they have many gods, right? But if this dialogue can be boiled down to this famous dilemma or this famous problem, it's called the Euthyphro dilemma. And philosophers who study ethics have been concerned with it for a very long time. So I have it as an either or here. So the Euthyphro dilemma is, well, if we equate morality with goodness, then we are left with two options. One, or A, an act is right only because God says it's right. The rightness or the goodness of something is entirely constituted by God's preference. Anything can be right for as long as God says that it is right. Okay, so that's the first option. Second option, it's goodness. What is good or what is right does not depend entirely on God, but God's preferences are determined by what's already good and what was already right. So God only says something is right. God is only pleased by something because it is good or because it is right. So that something has a moral status that's independent of God's preferences. Okay, why is this a problem? Bertrand Russell turned the Euthyphro dilemma into an argument against the existence of God, or really an argument against the rationality of being a theist. So Bertrand Russell, an English philosopher, says, this shows it doesn't make sense to believe in God, because if you equate morality with what is pleasing to God, you are left with a Euthyphro dilemma, and each option, A and B, each option is bad. Why is each option bad? Well, if A, an act is right only because God says it's right, then that makes what is right completely arbitrary. It can be anything, anything that God happens to prefer, anything that happens to please God becomes good, right? So A leads to the problem of arbitrariness on matters of morality. B avoids the arbitrariness at the cost of saying that there's something that ranks higher than God, that morality is a standard that even God himself has to abide by. Now, if this is true, then God is not God. Then there is something that ranks higher than God, and that is the standard of goodness or what is right. Okay, so ergo, Russell says it doesn't make sense to believe in God, right? Now, the Euthyphro dilemma, before I talk about a possible solution to it, the Euthyphro dilemma tells us that religion is not a quick fix to uncertainty about moral matters, because even if you equate morality with ethics with faith, if you equate morality with religion, you are still left with philosophical problems like the Euthyphro dilemma. There can be a solution. There can be a Christian solution to the Euthyphro dilemma. How do Christians respond to Bertrand Russell? I'll give you the solution, but we'll not explore it because we're not going to do philosophy of religion. That just means I'm going to explain it now, but we're not going to touch on it further after this week. So here's a Christian solution to the Euthyphro dilemma. It's the simple statement of God is good. Emphasis on is. God is good, God being perfect. The medieval philosophers describe God, one of the medieval philosophers described God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. A being so perfect, it's perfect in every way, and goodness is just one of God's perfections. So identity between God and what is morally good, right? So the solution goes, God will never command us to do what is bad, right? But if you're a Christian, you have some leftover problems because we have this bothersome story about Abraham being asked to sacrifice his son, Isaac, kill his own son. Okay. Now, according to the Christian solution to the Euthyphro dilemma, there is an objective moral standard, but it is internal to God. Being perfect in every way, goodness is part of him. Right? Now, there are further theological issues that we will not get into, but this is how some Christians address Russell's argument against theism based on the Euthyphro dilemma. Is the solution satisfying? I leave it to you to ponder on that question, especially if you consider yourself a Christian. But even if you do, even if you think the solution works, let me remind you that even if it's true that God is good, we still don't know what the good is. God may know, but we don't know. We're not God. And we don't usually have a direct line where we can just send a text message or make a phone call where we can ask God, is this good or is this not good? Right? So even if it's true that God is good, the simple statement, God is good, solves the Euthyphro dilemma, we're still left with the problem of not being God and not being certain about what the good is. So in this discussion of ethics and religion, I want to go back to Anthony Weston's rule book for arguments, which gives us a lot of points to ponder on, not just the technical definition of argument. Weston has the following reminder for believers, and I think it is worth heeding. Here's his reminder. Religious moralists often have declared that certain practices are wrong because they are contrary to the will of God. We should reply that God ought to be spoken for a little more cautiously. God's will is not easy to ascertain. And when God speaks so softly, it is easy to confuse that still small voice with our own personal prejudices. Okay. I think the take-home message from Weston's reminder is that Christians do not get a free pass on reflecting about morality, in arguing about right and wrong, because this reminder is very clearly telling us that sometimes God says it's right is not really coming from God, but coming from our own personal prejudice. We are against a certain group because we don't understand their sexuality, for instance, or we don't like the way they talk, or we were taught that that group of people were suspicious, right? So equating religion with morality does not get you very far. And Christians, theists, people who believe in any God, do not get a free pass on arguing about morality. In fact, there's good reason to say they have a greater burden to examine reasons for certain positions more closely because there's an element of being deceived. So the method of argument as inquiry applies to everyone, even to Christians, especially to people who believe in God. So nobody gets a free pass on the kind of arguing about ethical issues that we're going to engage in this course. Okay, so this is the end of the recording for module 1B, the second part.